Day 882 of the Trump administration, and tensions in the Middle East have reached a new height tonight after Iran shot down an American unmanned surveillance drone last in the Gulf of Oman, adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz last night. The United States says the drone was shot down in international airspace. That's the dot on the left of your screen. Iran claims it was shot down over Iranian territorial waters. The difference wouldn't be big. Both countries agree it was shot down and are in general agreement about where, but the distinction may prove to be important. The U.S. military released this video that shows smoke trailing from the drone as it goes down. Iranian state TV released this video that it claims shows Iran's Revolutionary Guard shooting the drone down. Earlier today, the president posted on Twitter, quote, "Iran made a very big mistake." Hours later, he repeated that statement while meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the Oval Office.
Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
How will you respond, Mr. President? How will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to go to war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out.
Mr. President,
obviously, you know, we're not going to be talking too much about it. You're going to find out. They made a very big mistake.
But then in an interesting twist, Trump also suggested that the drone being shot down could have been unintentional.
I have a feeling, I may be wrong and I may be right, but I'm right a lot. I have a feeling that it was a mistake made by somebody that shouldn't have been doing what they did.
Are you saying you think it wasn't intentional to strike the drone?
I don't know. I find it hard to believe it was intentional, if you want to know the truth. I think that it could have been somebody who was loose and stupid that did it. We'll be able to report back, and you'll understand exactly what happened. But it was a very foolish move. That I can tell you.
Somebody who is loose and stupid. Earlier today, the White House briefed congressional leaders on Iran, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Both Democratic leaders spoke to reporters after the briefing.
I told the president that these conflicts have a way of escalating. The president may not intend to go to war here, but we're worried that he and the administration may bumble into a war. We told the room that the Democratic position is that congressional approval must be required before funding any conflict in Iran.
We know that the high-tension wires are up there, and we must do everything we can not to escalate the situation, but also to make sure that our personnel in the region are safe.
Madam Speaker, are you personally convinced, based on the intelligence you've seen, that this was an Iranian attack on an American asset operating legally in international airspace?
Yes.
Today's news comes amid a week of rising tensions in the Middle East. The United States is blaming Iran for attacks on 2 tankers last week in the Gulf of Oman. Iran has denied any responsibility for those attacks. Here for our leadoff discussion on a Thursday night, our friend Michael Crowley, newly minted White House correspondent for the New York Times. Tessa Berenson, White House correspondent for Time Magazine, who interviewed the president this week. And with me here in New York, Ben Rhodes, former deputy national security advisor for President Obama. Michael, I want to start with you. A piece has just posted in the New York Times with your byline, along with Maggie Haberman, Michael Shear, and Eric Schmidt, in which you say that the president had approved military strikes against Iran to take place before dawn Friday, which would be now Iran time. You write, but the action was abruptly called off for the evening, putting a halt to what would have been the president's 3rd military action against targets in the Middle East. Tell us about this, Michael.
Well, that's right. I, with several colleagues doing good reporting, do have this story. And as late as 7 o'clock or so this evening, officials in the U.S. government did believe that there would be strikes on Iran. Our understanding was that this approval by President Trump followed a spirited debate among top U.S. officials in which key officials, including National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, were pushing for some sort of a military response to these Iranian actions, that the president did approve a strike. The plan, as we were told, was for the strike to occur tonight, U.S. time, which would have been pre-dawn in Iran. The goal was to avoid any casualties in Iran. So this would be the kind of strike that I guess you might call symbolic, although, of course, it would be an incredibly consequential and dramatic action. But the idea was not to kill any Iranians. Remember, Trump emphasized the fact that the U.S. drone that the Americans had shot down was unmanned. It was a surveillance drone with no pilot. And so I think the idea was somewhat to respond in kind, not to inflict any casualties, but to inflict some damage. But that there was a spirited debate about this. Some Trump officials, including Pompeo, have spoken publicly about the idea of reestablishing deterrence. That's a phrase that Pompeo has used, and I think that was part of the thinking here. For reasons that are not clear, the plan was pulled back. The president pulled back. The strikes were not executed, and our understanding is that they have not and will not happen tonight. It's not clear whether that means the plan is tabled forever, and it's not clear exactly what led to this kind of checked swing, you might say. But certainly further raises the drama and the stakes around this mounting confrontation with Iran.
This is a remarkably important piece of reporting. General Barry McCaffrey will be joining us in a few moments to discuss the implications from a military perspective. I want to talk to our former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben. This is a dramatic development, if true. It's been very, very hard, as we're going to speak to Tessa about in a moment, to track where President Trump's mind has been on this. He talks about big mistakes. He talks about things being relatively minor. Then he talks about it being somebody loose and stupid. This would be a marked escalation if we saw a U.S. attack on Iranian soil.
It would be a massive escalation for the United States of America to take any military action on Iranian soil. This is a president who doesn't seem to think there are going to be consequences for the things that he does. When you pull out of a nuclear deal that Iran is complying with, when you stack on sanctions and provocations and threats to the Iranians, you are going to evoke a response from the Iranians. And we are living through that response now. The announcement that they're increasing their enrichment, the shoot down of this drone. What we have to understand here, though, Ali, is if we were to take a strike, and let's say there are lots of IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard targets inside of Iran that we could take a shot at, the Iranians are going to respond to that. That is the logic of how they think about their national security.
And something you said on Rachel's show tonight, which is important for people who don't maybe have a great familiarity with the region, is that Iran's influence goes well beyond its own borders. So it's not Iran doing something to anybody in Iran. It's Libya, it's Syria, it's Lebanon, it's Iraq, it's Yemen, it's all over, it's Afghanistan.
We looked at the scenarios of what the Iranians would do if we took precisely the kind of strike that is being envisioned here. These are kinds of things that lots of people thought about, lots of analysts. The Iranians could respond in Iraq. They could try to attack our embassy there. They could respond in Afghanistan by fomenting instability there. They could attack in Lebanon in a terrorist attack. They could fire rockets from Hezbollah into Israel. They could attack in the Straits of Hormuz by trying to shut down the flow of oil, like we saw with these tankers on fire. I actually think what the Iranians have been doing is messaging to the United States and the world, here are the different ways in which we can respond. And so we have to recognize that this could be a very complicated asymmetric war, essentially. But it can escalate really fast into a very real and deadly and costly war against an adversary in Iran that is much more sophisticated, much more ready for this than Iraq or Afghanistan were, and look at how those conflicts turned out. The Iranians have been preparing for this contingency of a conflict with the United States for a very long time. And I don't think you can assume that they're going to take a military strike inside of Iran as something that they're not going to respond to at some point.
Tessa, the price of oil, Ben was just talking about the Strait of Hormuz, a remarkable proportion of the world's oil, much of which comes from that area around the Persian Gulf, goes through that Strait of Hormuz. The price of oil was up 5.5% in one day today on these increased tensions. But a lot of people have been saying in the last few weeks, the president doesn't want war with Iran. Bolton does, and Pompeo does. These have been guys who've been hawkish about Iran since day one, since they first learned to say the word Iran. You spoke to the president about it earlier this week, about the attacks on those tankers, the provenance of which are still disputed. And the president said those attacks he thought were relatively minor.
Yes, he did. Speaking of the provenance being disputed, he told us he does believe that Iran perpetrated those attacks, but we tried to draw him out a little bit on what would cause him to engage militarily. And what he told us is that he would as he said, certainly go to war with Iran to prevent the country from getting nuclear weapons, but he would leave it a, quote, question mark, whether he would engage with them based on any of the actions in the Strait of Hormuz. And one reason for that is he told us, in his view, that is now a much less strategically important area for the United States than it used to be. He said we don't get as much of our oil there as we used to, and so it was making him less likely to want to respond, because in his view, we would basically just be protecting the oil supplies for other nations more than for ourselves. And that's something President Trump really doesn't like in foreign policy, is the idea that America is protecting the interests of other countries at the expense of ourselves.
Right. And so the president did say that the one reason he would, when asked why he would go to war in Iran, he said to prevent them from getting a bomb.
Yes.
I want to ask you, Michael, about whether your reporting suggests that this idea of this strike that was being considered as late as 7 p.m. Eastern time this evening, is that still on the table as far as you know?
I just don't think we have the answer to that question right now. We did not hear definitively that it is off the table. Again, the circumstances of the pullback are not entirely clear. So I don't know what to tell you about that. But look, what we do know is that there are some very influential Trump officials who are not afraid of using force and using force against Iran. And there are even some signs that they are eager to do it. Viewers of this show, I think, will be familiar with John Bolton's very hawkish record, and that he has spoken and written publicly over the years, frequently advocating pretty aggressive use of American force and power, that it's not something we should shy away from, that our adversaries have to be met with force. And I think that philosophy has a very strong current in the Trump administration. What's interesting is that Donald Trump himself has often struck a very different tone. Of course, he was extremely critical, even as a candidate, of the U.S. war in Iraq, has repeatedly said that America has made dumb mistakes getting tangled up in Middle East conflicts. Wars are expensive, and basically doesn't seem to have much appetite for that kind of a thing. But what may be going on here is that Trump has really put so much focus on Iran and made it almost a kind of a prideful battle with the regime in Tehran, dating back to his denunciations of the Iran nuclear deal, his withdrawal from the deal last year, that it has become a kind of matter of pride, as well as very real geostrategic issues like the Strait of Hormuz.
I want to just update the story that you have just filed, Michael. The operation was underway and in its early stages when it was called off. A senior administration official said planes were in the air, ships were in position, but no missiles had been fired when word came to stand down, the official said. Ben Rhodes, talk to me about where things like this go. I'll have Barry McCaffrey on in a few minutes to talk militarily about how this goes. But there are people who, Michael Crowley said, in the U.S. administration that are eager to do it, eager to go to war with Iran. And there are people in Iran who are eager to go to war with America. Both countries have these factions. For whom does this war, such a war, make sense?
Nobody. Assuming this escalates, which I unfortunately think a conflict between the U.S. and Iran would escalate, whether it happens gradually or very quickly is a question. I think everybody would end up losing in the end. However, what you have is hardliners inside of the Iranian system and hardliners inside of the U.S. system, both of whom have gotten control of the policies of those two governments. So we're in a situation right now where there's an escalation cycle started by the United States when Trump pulled out of the nuclear agreement.
Because Iran was certified to be in compliance with that agreement.
Certified compliant with that nuclear agreement.
At no point was Iran not in compliance with that.
No, the IAEA, the international agency responsible for certifying compliance, found that they were not only meeting all their obligations, there were inspectors there to make sure that they were doing that. We pull out, we sanction them, we isolate ourselves. What we see here is a completely incoherent approach to foreign policy, right? Trump wants the feeling that he's confronting Iran, but he doesn't want a war. And yet everything that he's been doing since he pulled out of that nuclear deal has made a war more likely. At the same time, he has no Secretary of Defense. So not only do we have the potential kind of chaos if this report is true, of a military operation literally underway being pulled back. We don't even have a Secretary of Defense, nor have we had one for 6 months, a confirmed Secretary of Defense. We don't have clear decision-making process in the National Security Council. That's been widely reported. We have said for a long time, Donald Trump has not been tested by a crisis. We are seeing right now before our own eyes what happens when this kind of chaotic White House and this kind of incoherent foreign policy and this kind of belligerent rhetoric collides with the reality of a regime in Iran that has its own interests, that has its own hardliners, that is not going to capitulate just in the face of Trump's threats and rhetoric. And Trump has to decide now whether he wants to follow his own rhetorical direction towards Iran and the interest of his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, all the way into a shooting war with the Islamic Republic of Iran, or whether or not he thinks, as he said during the campaign, that the U.S. has fought too many wars in the Middle East. And really, the only person who knows the answer to what's going to happen is Donald Trump. And it sounds like he's made both decisions within the last few hours, and that is truly extraordinary.
That is truly extraordinary. And Tessa, we turn to you because maybe the only way to know how this turns out is to have been in the room with Donald Trump and to be able to look into the whites of his eyes and determine which Donald Trump we're talking about. Because as Ben describes it, there are two distinct directions the president can take in this case. He can tell the hawks in his administration to stand down or stand back a little bit, or he can decide that this is his moment and that war with Iran makes sense. Which Donald Trump do you think you saw?
Right. So I think it's interesting, too, that Ben used the word rhetorics and rhetorically, because that's something President Trump talked to us a lot about on Monday. And as we were discussing these specific incidents of aggression from Iran, President Trump was emphasizing to us that he feels that on a rhetorical level, Iran has softened its stance towards the United States. And President Trump was saying in his mind back in 2015, you were hearing, quote, death to America from the country. And he said he doesn't hear that anymore. And so he feels that regardless of whatever these actions the country is taking, which, again, he on Monday told us that he thinks the attacks on the oil tankers were, quote, very minor. Rhetorically, he feels like Iran is in a better posture towards the United States. And so he was presenting that as what may be a rationale for not engaging further in response.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.